December 17th, 1944. Around 5:30 in the morning near Honsfeld, Belgium, the Tiger tank's engine coughed a few times and then went silent. SS Commander Johann Paper slammed his fist on the hatch, the metal ringing in the cold air. His driver tried again to bring the big Maybach engine to life, but it didn't even turn over. The fuel gauge sat on empty. A moment later, the driver called up, voice tight with worry. The backup tank was dry too. Paper climbed out of the tank, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. All around him, the German armored force meant to spearhead the Ardennes attack sat completely still. Dozens of tanks, more than 100 half-tracks, and thousands of Waffen-SS troops were stuck because they had no fuel at all. Through the mist, Paper saw the American position ahead. The U.S. troops had pulled out so quickly that fires still burned in metal barrels and half-finished cups of coffee sat where they had been left. And beyond that were neat rows of jerry cans, thousands of them, stacked like some impossible gift. His adjutant opened one, smelled it, and confirmed it was high-grade American gasoline. Immediately, the men rushed to refuel their machines. Paper walked along the pile, counting as he went. The amount of fuel was staggering, tens of thousands of gallons. More than enough to push his entire group toward the Meuse River. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this one place than many German units had seen in months. And standing there, watching his men pour American gasoline into German tanks, Paper felt a heavy realization settle over him. If the Americans could simply leave this much behind, if they had so much that they didn't even bother to protect it, then the war's outcome was already decided. Germany hadn't just misjudged the enemy, they hadn't understood them at all. 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Hitler's armaments minister Albert Speer had given a report that should have stopped all major German attacks. Allied bombers had wrecked Germany's fuel plants. One facility that made 175,000 tons in April was down to only 5,000 by September. Other plants were running at barely a fraction of their normal output. The numbers made defeat obvious. In 1944, the United States pumped 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, even with synthetic fuel and captured Romanian fields, only managed about 33 million, barely a sliver of what the Americans produced. Germany was trying to run a modern war with supply lines that still relied on horses while the U.S. had more fuel than its armies could use. A German logistics officer had calculated that the Ardennes attack needed around 4.5 million gallons of fuel just to reach Antwerp. Hitler ordered 5 million gallons set aside, but only half actually reached the front line because of transport problems. The entire operation depended on capturing American fuel, a sign of weakness, not strength. Meanwhile, the Americans had laid pipelines across France and were running the Red Ball Express, a huge truck system that delivered more than 12,000 tons of supplies every day. By December 1944, U.S. forces in Europe were using over 1 million gallons of fuel daily and still receiving more than they burned. Paper knew all this. At only 29, he was already a hardened officer and one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS. He had survived the Eastern Front and understood that fuel mattered even more than ammunition. His unit had been chosen as the key thrust of the entire offensive. 2 days before the attack, he attended a final briefing. His superior, General Sepp Dietrich, was direct. They would only reach the Meuse if they captured American fuel dumps. Paper's troops were given just over 30,000 gallons to start, enough for roughly 50 miles of heavy fighting, while the Meuse was more than 60 miles away. The plan was flawed from the start. As his column moved out on December 16th, Paper ordered his tanks to travel in single file and shut down engines during any pause longer than a few minutes. Capturing fuel was more important than any other objective. The difference between the two armies was obvious. That same morning, an American tank officer only 20 miles away wrote in his logbook that his unit had received another 8,000 gallons of fuel, its third delivery of the week, and its storage tanks were already full. At 5:30 a.m. on the 16th, the German artillery opened the offensive with a massive barrage that used more shells in 2 hours than some earlier operations had used in total. But even this show of strength hid deeper shortages. Paper's tanks started moving at 7 a.m., already late. The roads that looked like highways on maps were in reality narrow, muddy lanes. Trucks and tanks backed up for miles. At Lanzerath, they were delayed for nearly 10 hours by only 18 American soldiers. The vehicles ran their engines the entire time, burning away precious fuel. When his column finally broke free and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, They had gone barely 20 miles and already used almost half their fuel. At that pace, they would run out long before they reached even the halfway point to the Meuse. And the American depot at Hansfeld wasn't even a major supply center. The depot at Hansfeld was only meant to be a forward fuel point for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Army classified it as a temporary Class 3B site, basically a quick refueling stop. But what paper found there was far more fuel than a whole German panzer division usually received in a month. His adjutant, Hans Gruber, later said they found huge stacks of jerry cans, each holding about 5 gallons, piled into mounds 3 meters high and stretching for what looked like a couple hundred meters. The Americans didn't even try to destroy them before pulling out. The gasoline was high-octane aviation fuel mixed with motor fuel of 80 octane or better. German engines, especially the touchy Maybach engines inside Tiger tanks, were built for around 74 octane. The American fuel was almost too good, and it actually caused mechanical issues in some of the German vehicles. As Paper's men filled their tanks, they discovered more. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann found shipping papers in the depot office. He could read English because he'd worked in his father's import business before the war. The documents showed the fuel had traveled from Texas to New York, then across the Atlantic to Liverpool, over the Channel to Normandy, and then moved by truck hundreds of miles to Hansfeld. The whole trip of more than 6,000 miles had taken under 6 weeks. Hoffmann later recalled showing the paperwork to Paper. Paper looked at it twice, crushed the pages in his hand, and his face went white. Neither man had to say anything. They both understood what that meant. Another soldier, Private Ernst Kara, found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days old. One headline talked about the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun that could push 300,000 gallons a day. A single pipeline was moving more fuel in 24 hours than Paper's entire group would use in the whole offensive. To understand why this shocked Paper, you have to know what Germany was dealing with in late 1944. Since the spring, Allied bombers had destroyed most of Germany's synthetic fuel plants. Production had fallen by nearly 90%. The Luftwaffe couldn't keep its planes flying and cut pilot training down from 250 hours to barely 60. The German Navy's big ships were stuck in port with almost no fuel left. U-boats added snorkels so they could save diesel by running underwater longer. At home, normal car traffic had disappeared since 1942. Gasoline was so rare that even a few liters could bring the Gestapo to investigate theft. Farmers were going back to horse-drawn plows because their tractors didn't have fuel. Meanwhile, the United States was producing more than 2/3 of the world's oil. The oil field in East Texas alone pumped out more petroleum than all the regions Germany had conquered. American refineries had so much crude that companies like Standard Oil were experimenting with new products simply because they didn't know what to do with excess. With roughly 50,000 gallons captured at Hansfeld, Paper's armored group pushed ahead quickly. By midday on December 17th, they had reached Bullingen, where they grabbed more supplies, food, ammunition, and even maps marking other American fuel depots nearby. But the maps showed something unsettling. The Americans had fuel stored everywhere. Almost every major intersection had its own depot. The U.S. First Army alone had 3.5 million gallons in reserve. Paper's column kept moving toward Lignaville, where his troops carried out the Malmedy massacre, killing 84 American prisoners. Even this terrible act was tied to the German fuel crisis. Paper later claimed he didn't have enough gasoline to transport captives. By the evening of December 17th, Paper's lead units reached Stavelot, where a massive American fuel site held more than 2 million gallons. If they captured it, they would have enough fuel to reach the Meuse River for sure. But as the first German vehicles neared the depot, American engineers were already taking action. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had been warned the Germans were coming. His orders were simple: destroy the fuel at any cost. The Stavelot depot held over 2 million gallons stacked across 15 acres. At 4:30 p.m. on the 17th, as German scouts got close, Brewster gave the command. Engineers spilled gasoline between the stacks and passed out white phosphorus grenades. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis threw the first one. He later said the explosion was huge, shooting a wall of fire 100 feet into the air. In minutes, the entire depot was blazing. When Paper's tanks arrived, they saw a column of black smoke rising 1,000 feet overhead. The fire burned for 3 days and destroyed enough gasoline to send Paper's whole division to Antwerp and back. One of Paper's crewmen later described watching their commander stand silently on his turret, staring at the flames. After several minutes, he climbed down and said, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons just to keep it from us. What are we doing here?" And he wasn't wrong. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were torching fuel dumps before the Germans could reach them. At Trois-Ponts, more than 1 million gallons went up in flames. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were burned. Altogether, the Americans deliberately destroyed more than 8 million gallons in the first week, more than Germany had planned for the entire offensive. The reason they could waste so much was simple. Their supply system was beyond anything the Germans could imagine. The Red Ball Express had already moved over 400,000 tons of supplies using 6,000 trucks running day and night. Each truck burned around 40 gallons daily. The supply system itself used more fuel than Germany's Army Group B received in a month. By December 1944, the Motor Transport Service had 230 truck companies running on color-coded roads. They delivered 20,000 tons of supplies daily, including 3,000 tons of fuel. Colonel James Snyder, the First Army's logistics officer, wrote on December 18th that they had received almost 1.9 million gallons the day before and issued about 1.6 million. They added more than 200,000 gallons to their reserves while fighting. Even more fuel came through the growing network of pipelines. Operation Pluto had laid pipes under the English Channel, sending 1 million gallons a day from Britain to the continent. Lines stretched inland as well. One pipeline from Cherbourg to Paris carried 800,000 gallons a day. Another along the Seine moved 650,000. By December, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were using around 7.5 million gallons daily, but receiving more than 8 million. They were actually growing their reserves while advancing. As Paper drove deeper into Belgium on December 18th, it became impossible to ignore how hopeless the German situation was. At Chenouse, they overran another depot, 5,000 gallons gone in just 3 hours of fighting. Tiger tanks burned through about 2.5 gallons of fuel for every mile they moved in combat. Panther tanks used around 1.5 gallons per mile. In the rough hills and muddy tracks of the Ardennes, fuel use jumped by nearly 40%. Otto Dingler, the maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, later wrote that by midday on December 18th, they had already gone through about 67,000 gallons since the attack began. The units had only captured around 55,000 gallons, meaning they were already running in the red. American intelligence teams listening to German radio traffic knew exactly how desperate Paper's fuel situation was. General Courtney Hodges sent a message to all units warning them that the Germans were critically short on gasoline and ordering that any fuel stores in danger of being seized should be destroyed immediately. That same day, American C-47 transports flew more than 300 missions to drop supplies into Bastogne, including about 160,000 gallons of fuel. The U.S. was airlifting more gasoline to a surrounded town than Paper's whole battle group had in total. By December 19th, when Paper's column fought around Stillmont, the fuel crisis had turned severe. Tanks were being abandoned not because they were knocked out, but simply because their tanks were dry. Paper pooled the last of his fuel, maybe 8,000 gallons, which was barely enough for one more attack or one retreat, but not both. At the same time, Allied supply officers were already planning for January. Brigadier General Morris Gilland requested 245 million gallons for the next month, and his request was approved immediately. The difference between the two armies wasn't only how much fuel they had, American vehicles were also built to use fuel more efficiently. Sherman tanks burned less than a gallon per mile, compared to the Tiger's 2.5. American trucks could get 8 miles per gallon even when fully loaded. Their parts were standardized, and repairs were quick. German units, on the other hand, used a mix of German, French, and Soviet vehicles, each needing different fuel, different oil, and different spare parts. Every difference made their logistics worse. On December 20th, Paper received a final radio message. The fuel convoy heading toward him had been destroyed by Allied planes. There would be no more deliveries. They were told to continue with what they had left. Paper gathered his officers. One of them, Vera Perka, said plainly that they had fuel for maybe 20 kilometers. The Meuse River was more than 30 kilometers away. According to Hans Gruber, Paper told them, "We are facing an enemy who can burn more fuel just to keep it from us than we were given for this whole operation." What looked like a miracle at Hansfeld meant nothing to them. "We cannot win. This understanding was spreading across the German command. General Otto von Manschufel, leading the 5th Panzer Army, later said that when he learned the Americans had simply burned 8 million gallons instead of risking capture, he knew the offensive was doomed from the start. Colonel Friedrich von der Heydt, captured on December 23rd, told interrogators that American troops threw away chocolate while his own men hadn't tasted any in 2 years, and that U.S. forces burned fuel by the millions while Germans counted every liter. By December 21st, Paper's men were surrounded at La Gleize. Their tanks had no fuel left. The American units surrounding them, the 30th Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, and the 3rd Armored Division, had a combined fuel allowance of more than 300,000 gallons for that single day. Paper had maybe 1,000. One American soldier, Private Richard McKinney, wrote home saying they had surrounded Germans who ran out of gas and joked that their unit used more fuel heating coffee than the Germans had for their tanks. The American response showed how far industrial warfare had advanced. Patton's Third Army swung north in a rapid maneuver that required more than 350,000 gallons of fuel just to reposition, something the Germans thought impossible, yet the Americans did it in 3 days. On December 23rd, clear weather returned. Allied aircraft flew 2,000 sorties, each burning fuel at a rate the German Air Force could only dream of. P-47s burn about 300 gallons per hour. B-26 bombers use around 200 gallons per hour. One day of air missions burned more fuel than the Germans had assigned to their entire winter offensive. During the night of December 23rd to 24th, Paper and his remaining men abandoned their vehicles and slipped out on foot. Out of the 119 tanks and assault guns that began the drive, 39 were still technically functional, but all of them were out of fuel. The Germans destroyed them with their remaining ammunition. One soldier, Heinz Gauls, later described how the last fuel, barely 200 gallons, was drained out of every vehicle. Paper personally destroyed his own command tank. Machines worth millions were left useless because they had no fuel. Of the roughly 5,000 men who started with Paper's group, about 770 made it back. They had covered about 60 miles, seized several American depots, and learned just how vast Allied supply power truly was. News of Paper's findings spread quickly. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received reports listing the American fuel amounts the Germans had encountered. His chief of staff wrote that Model read the figures twice: 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, 2 million burned at Stavelot, 8 million destroyed elsewhere. The Model said, "We are not fighting the same war." But when Hitler was informed on December 28th, he refused to believe the numbers. Albert Speer wrote that Hitler insisted the reports were lies. Even when shown photographs of the burning fuel dumps at Stavelot, he dismissed them as staged images. But ordinary soldiers understood better. Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife saying the Americans destroyed more fuel in a day than Germany received in a month, and that the U.S. drove tanks like Germans marched on foot. He ended with, "This war is lost." The fuel crisis revealed a bigger truth. By 1944, the United States produced half the world's manufactured goods. They built a new aircraft every few minutes, a new ship every day, and a new tank every 7 minutes. Oil numbers told the same story. The U.S. produced 1.8 billion barrels, the Soviet Union 110 million, Germany, including synthetic fuel, around 33 million, and Japan just over 2.5 million. All Axis countries combined produced less than 2% of America's petroleum output. Every major German offensive after 1942 was limited by fuel shortages. Every American offensive was backed by a supply system the Germans simply couldn't imagine. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen noted an incident on December 27th when bad weather cut fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons for the day. Some officers were worried until someone pointed out that even this reduced amount was still more than the Germans had been given for their entire winter attack. German prisoners from the Ardennes were stunned not only by American firepower, but by American waste. Seeing U.S. troops toss out half-eaten rations or use gasoline for heating bothered them more than artillery barrages. One German named Reichel told interrogators that they always knew American production was high, but seeing soldiers casually waste what Germans treasured made the scale real. Every soldier who saw American abundance understood the war was unwinnable. These impressions spread in letters home despite censorship efforts. One soldier, Ernst Muller, wrote that Americans washed clothes in gasoline, fed chocolate to their dogs, and fired artillery just for holiday celebrations. People kept saying the same thing over and over again during the war. You can't fight someone who has endless resources. The psychological effect alone crushed many of the ideas the Germans had about being superior. How could the Americans, who they viewed as soft and spoiled, have so much more than the so-called master race, which was now struggling just to get basic supplies? During the Nuremberg trials, German commanders repeatedly blamed logistics, especially the lack of fuel, for their defeat. Field Marshal Keitel admitted, "We had the advantage in 1940 and 1941. But by 1944, we couldn't even move our troops." Meanwhile, the Americans shifted whole armies around like it was nothing. Even Piper, who tried to defend himself from Malmedy killings, said something similar. He explained that every decision after December 17th was shaped by fuel shortages. They couldn't move fast, couldn't chase the enemy, and sometimes couldn't even retreat. "The Americans drove wherever they wanted, while we counted every liter," he said. General Heinz Guderian put it bluntly, "When Piper captured 50,000 gallons and thought it meant everything, but to the Americans it meant nothing, the war was already over." The story still stands out today because it shows the moment when industrial warfare reached its peak. Wars weren't won by bravery anymore. They were won by factories. Romantic ideas about war died in the Ardennes, surrounded by tanks that simply couldn't move. Historians later showed the numbers clearly. By 1944, the Allies were outproducing the Axis by more than 5-1 in many areas, and in fuel it was closer to 50-1. No amount of training or skill could close that gap. During World War II, America built over 324,000 aircraft. Germany made about 119,000. America built more than 88,000 tanks. Germany made around 46,000. And the biggest difference was oil. The U.S. refined 1.8 billion barrels in 1944, while Germany managed around 33 million. On December 24, 1944, while Piper's men slipped away on foot, leaving behind 39 tanks, 70 half-tracks, and more than 170 other vehicles, the truth became impossible to ignore. They had captured 50,000 gallons that felt like a miracle, only to realize it meant absolutely nothing to an enemy who could burn millions in a day. One of Piper's officers later said in 1975, "That morning at Hansfeld, when we found the fuel, we celebrated like we'd won a prize. But by that evening, after learning about the millions burned at Stavelot, we understood we had already lost. What was precious to us was meaningless to them. 50,000 gallons was less than what a single American armor division used in 2 days. Less than what the Red Ball Express burned in a few hours. Nothing more than a tiny fraction of America's daily consumption." General J. Lawton Collins later wrote that the Germans badly misjudged the situation. They assumed the Americans valued fuel the same way they did, as something rare. They couldn't imagine a country that had so much it could burn millions of gallons just to keep the enemy from getting it. Operation Watch on the Rhine was doomed from the beginning. The German attack used around 2.8 million gallons, nearly half of their available supply, including what they captured. During that same period, the Americans used 267 million gallons, almost 100 times more. The German army lost huge numbers of men, tanks, and aircraft. But what hurt the most was the loss of hope. German soldiers who saw how much the Americans had realized they weren't fighting a winnable war. They were simply witnessing the end. Piper survived the war and was released from prison in 1956. He was killed in France in 1976. But years earlier, in 1967, he told a historian that finding that American depot was the worst moment. "If we had run out earlier, we might have pulled back with dignity," he said. "Instead, we learned the Americans had oceans of fuel while we had drops. We learned it was impossible." The lesson still applies today. In modern wars, logistics beat tactics. Production beats bravery. Abundance beats determination. German soldiers in 1944 may have been more experienced, but it didn't matter. The Americans had an industrial machine behind them that could afford to waste more than Germany could make. You could see this in every fuel can at Hansfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, and every pipeline stretching across France. Wars between major powers are decided by factories and refineries, not famous generals. Colonel Trevor Dupuy later noted that each American soldier in December 1944 was supported by roughly 67 pounds of supplies a day. A German soldier got about 3. Americans complain about waste. Germans would have seen that waste as unimaginable luxury. In 1984, decades after the fighting ended, veterans from both sides met at La Glise. The museum there still has Piper's Tiger tank sitting where it ran out of gas on December 23rd. A former German soldier, Karl Wortmann, stood beside it with an American veteran named Roy Anderson from the 30th Infantry Division. "We always wondered why you stopped," Anderson said. "We thought it was a tactical move." Wortmann gave a bitter laugh. "We stopped because the tanks were empty. You burned millions just to keep us from getting any. How could we fight that?" Anderson went quiet, then said, "We never knew you were that short. We had so much we never thought about it." That short conversation summed up the whole story of December 1944. One side measured fuel by the gallon. The other measured it by the millions. One hoarded every can. The other burned oceans. The result was already chosen long before the battle ended. German documents from the time make it painfully clear. Army Group B noted. December 16th, offensive starts, only 70% of minimum fuel needed. December 17th, Piper captures 50,000 gallons. December 18th, several depots destroyed, over 5 million gallons lost. December 19th, fuel critical, unit stuck. December 24th, vehicles abandoned, fuel gone. Meanwhile, the U.S. First Army recorded. December 16th, 3.7 million gallons in reserve. December 17th, destroyed 2.2 million gallons to avoid capture. December 18th, received another 1.8 million. December 24th, reserves back up to 4.1 million. The Americans treated millions of gallons casually. The Germans treasured each small can. Beyond quantity, the Americans also had better quality fuel. Their refineries used advanced processes the Germans couldn't match, producing higher-octane gas that made their planes and vehicles run better. German engines, built for lower quality fuel, sometimes ran worse when using captured American gasoline. Fuel shortages touched every part of the German soldier's life. One wrote in his diary on December 20th that they marched 30 kilometers because there was no fuel for trucks, passing abandoned American vehicles that still had engines idling for warmth. They kept the engines running while we marched through the snow. Medical services were crippled. Ambulances couldn't reach the wounded. Hospitals couldn't power their generators. Men died waiting for rides that never came. Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting testified, "We had skilled surgeons and supplies captured from the Americans, but no fuel for ambulances. Soldiers died who could have survived if we had just 10 kilometers of transport." These discoveries broke the illusion the Germans had been fed about American weakness. Soldiers had been told the Americans were soft and incapable. Instead, they saw a nation that could destroy more fuel than Germany had in total. Goebbels' diary entry on December 28th reads, "Reports show serious morale problems. Soldiers write about American superiority, and it is undermining our story." The tale spread faster than any censorship. The myth of German supremacy crumbled when troops came face-to-face with American logistics. The failure in the Ardennes left Germany with only one option: desperate defense. General Jodl said at Nuremberg, "After the Ardennes, we knew it was over. We played our last card and discovered the enemy held all the aces." Seeing German desperation, the Allies targeted fuel production. By February 1945, German fuel output had stopped. The Luftwaffe was grounded. Pilot training was canceled. The Wehrmacht became static, destroyed little by mobile enemies. Spring 1945 brought surreal scenes. German units surrendered not because they were defeated in combat, but because they couldn't move. Entire panzer divisions sat helpless as Allied forces drove past. General Major Fritz Baulein described the situation. "We had 42 tanks in working order, experienced crews, and ammunition. We had 300 liters of fuel, not enough to reach the next town. We destroyed our tanks and walked to surrender." Meanwhile, the American advance was limited only by traffic jams caused by too many vehicles. Patton's Third Army alone had 15,000 vehicles. The crisis faced by Paper's Kampfgruppe shows how industrial capacity decided World War II. When Paper stood among the captured jerrycans that December morning, he saw the truth. They were fighting an enemy whose waste exceeded anything they had. The numbers tell the story. German offensive fuel allocation, 5 million gallons. Fuel destroyed by Americans, 8 million gallons. Daily American consumption, 7.5 million gallons. Paper's capture at Hansfeld, 50,000 gallons, less than 1% of American daily supply. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans and perhaps 100,000 Germans. It drained the Wehrmacht's last reserves. Its lasting impact, however, was showing German soldiers the scale of American abundance. Paper's discovery wasn't just about fuel. It revealed the nature of industrial warfare. Victory went to the side that could produce the most petroleum, steel, and aluminum. Germany never had a real chance. The final irony came later, when Americans cataloged abandoned German equipment at La Gleize. They found 39 perfectly intact tanks left behind, abandoned solely for lack of fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report noted, fuel required, 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal. Source, local reserves. Time, 4 hours. What was impossible for the Germans, saving their best tanks with 8,000 gallons, was trivial for the Americans. This was Paper's revelation at Hansfeld. It wasn't just that America had more fuel. It was that their abundance operated on a scale that made German scarcity irrelevant. The war was effectively over once American industry mobilized. Hansfeld showed what had been true since 1942. Germany was fighting the impossible, counting defeat by the gallon, while America measured success by oceans. Today, Paper's Tiger tank sits in a museum at La Gleize, fuel gauge empty, a monument to the moment when tactical skill met logistical reality and was lost. Visitors often ask why such powerful tanks were abandoned. The answer is simple: no fuel.